Margaret Collins woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. The morning light filtered through her thin curtains, casting a warm glow across her small bedroom. At 78 years old, Margaret had settled into a quiet routine that rarely changed. She would make her tea, eat a piece of toast with jam, and spend her morning reading or watching the neighborhood from her second-floor apartment. Window today started no differently. Her joints ached as she slowly made her way to the kitchen. The pain in her fingers had gotten worse over the years. The arthritis made simple tasks difficult, but Margaret never complained. She had lived through harder times. The calendar on her refrigerator showed it was Tuesday. Tuesday meant that her neighbor, Sam Peterson, would bring her mail up along with any flyers or newspapers from the lobby. Sam was 62, a retired mail carrier who had taken it upon himself to check on Margaret every few days. She appreciated his kindness, though she would never admit how much she looked forward to their brief chats at precisely 10:30. There was a gentle knock at her door. Margaret smiled. Sam was always on time. "Good morning, Margaret," Sam said when she opened the door. "Ice." His friendly face was slightly flushed from climbing the stairs. "Beautiful day out there, so they say," Margaret replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Would you like some tea?" "Can't today. Meeting some friends for lunch. But I brought your mail." He handed her a small stack of envelopes, mostly bills and advertisements. But then he pulled out a bright blue flyer from his pocket. "And I brought you this. Thought you might be interested." Margaret took the flyer and read the large print at the top. Oak Ridge Summer Concert Series auditions next week. She raised an eyebrow at Sam. "And why would I be interested in this?" she asked Sam. Shrugged. Patty Mills, who was supposed to play the opening night, broke her wrist. "They're looking for someone to fill in. I'm on the town cultural committee now, remember?" He pointed to the bottom of the flyer where he had written, "They need someone." "To fill in last minute? Why not you?"
Great.
Let out a short laugh. "It's Sam. Don't be silly. These concerts are for young people with fresh talent, not old piano teachers with arthritic hands." "You were the best piano teacher in Oak Ridge for 40 years, Sam said firmly. "And I've heard you play when I'm coming up the stairs." "You still have it, Margaret." After Sam left, Margaret put the flyer on her kitchen table and tried to forget about it. But throughout the day, her eyes kept drifting back to it. The Summer Concert Series was a big event in their small town. Local talents performed each weekend throughout July and August in the town square. People brought picnic blankets and lawn chairs. Families gathered to enjoy music under the stars. Margaret had attended many times over the years, often proudly, watching her former students perform, but she had never played herself. She had always been the teacher, not the performer. That evening, Margaret sat at her upright piano. It was an old friend, one that had been with her for nearly 50 years. The dark wood was worn in places, and one of the keys had a small chip, but the sound was still rich and warm. She ran her fingers over the keys without pressing down, feeling the smooth ivory beneath her fingertips. Margaret had not performed in public since she was in her 20s. Back then, she had dreams of playing in grand concert halls. But life had other plans. She got married young to Joe Collins, a kind man who worked at the local factory. They had planned to have children, but it never happened. Instead, Margaret poured her love into teaching piano to the children of Oak Ridge. For 40 years, she had taught countless students in the small music room she had set up in their home. Some went on to become quite accomplished. Others just learned enough to enjoy music for themselves. Margaret had been content with her choice, finding joy in nurturing talent rather than showcasing her own. After Joe died 10 years ago, Margaret had sold their house and moved into the apartment. She had continued teaching until 5 years ago. When the arthritis made it too painful, since then, her piano had been mostly for her own enjoyment, a private comfort in her solitude. Now, looking at the flyer Sam had brought, something stirred inside her, a feeling she had not experienced in a long time. It was like a small flame flickering to life after being nearly extinguished. "This is foolish," she muttered to herself. But her hands moved to the keys anyway, and she began to play a simple melody, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It had always been one of her favorites. The notes came easily, flowing from memory through her fingers despite their stiffness. As she played, she thought about the auditions.
But
They would probably expect something more challenging than a nocturne. If she were serious about this, which she wasn't, she reminded herself she would need to choose something that showed skill but also emotion. Shifted, and she began to play the opening notes of the ballade. It was a demanding piece, one that required both technical skill and emotional depth. As she played, she stumbled over some of the more difficult passages. Her fingers weren't as quick as they once were, but the music was still there inside her, waiting to be expressed. She played until the evening light faded, and she had to turn on the lamp beside the piano. By then her hands were aching, but her mind was made up. It was probably a mistake. But she would audition. The next morning, Margaret called the number on the flyer. The woman who answered sounded surprised when Margaret explained why she was calling. "You want to audition? It's for the opening night performance?" The woman's voice held a note of disbelief. "Yes," Margaret said firmly. "I understand you need someone." "To replace Patty Mills? Well, yes, but—" There was a pause. "May I ask about your experience?" "I was a piano teacher in Oak Ridge for 40 years, Margaret replied. "Before that, I studied at the State University." "I see." Another pause. "And your name?" "Margaret Collins." "Oh, Mrs. Collins. I think my cousin took lessons from you years ago." "Nancy Larson." Margaret smiled. "Yes, I remember Nancy. She had a good ear but never wanted to practice her scales." The woman laughed. "That sounds like Nancy. Well, Mrs. Collins, the auditions are next Tuesday at 2 o'clock at the community center. Each performer has 10 minutes. Do you know what piece you'll be playing? A Chopin's Ballade, no? One in G minor?" There was a longer pause this time. "That's quite challenging." "Yes, it is," Margaret agreed. "But it's what I'll be playing." After hanging up, Margaret sat very still. What had she just done? The ballade was indeed challenging, especially for someone whose fingers didn't always cooperate, but she would have less than a week to prepare. And even if by some miracle she played it well, would they actually choose someone her age for their concert series? But as these doubts swirled in her mind, Margaret felt something else too. A sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She got up and walked to her bookshelf, where she kept her old sheet music. Finding the ballade, she returned to the piano. "Well," she said to the empty room, "we'd better get to work." Than she had in decades. She woke up early each morning, did gentle stretches for her hands that an occupational therapist had once shown her, and then played for hours. She took breaks when the pain became too much, soaking her hands in warm water with Epsom salts. Sam noticed her renewed energy when he visited. "So you're really doing it?" he asked, hearing the music as he climbed the stairs. "It seems I am," Margaret replied. "Oh, I must be crazy." "Not crazy," Sam said with a smile. "Brave." Margaret wasn't sure about that. As Tuesday approached, her nervousness grew. What if she made a fool of herself? What if her hands failed her completely? What if the committee laughed at the old woman, who thought she could still play? But underneath these fears was a quiet determination. She had spent her life helping others find their musical voice. Perhaps it wasn't too late to find her own again. Tuesday morning arrived with a bright sun and clear blue skies. Margaret woke up earlier than usual, her mind already running through the notes of Chopin's Ballade. She had practiced until her fingers ached the night before, finally stopping. When her neighbor from below knocked on the ceiling with a broom handle, Margaret had apologized the next time she saw Mrs. Green in the hallway. But the older woman just smiled and said she had enjoyed the free concert. Margaret took extra care getting ready that day. She selected her best dress, a simple blue one. She usually saved for church or special occasions. She pinned her silver hair neatly, applied a touch of lipstick, put on the pearl earrings Joe had given her for their 30th anniversary. Looking in the mirror, she saw a well-dressed elderly woman. But she wondered if others would see only her age. Sam had offered to drive her to the community center, and Margaret had accepted gratefully. Her arthritis made the 10-block walk difficult, especially on days when she needed to save her energy for playing. Nervous? Sam asked as they drove down Maple Street. Terrified, Margaret admitted, I haven't played for an audience in over 50 years, and that was just for the college recital. You'll be wonderful, Sam assured her. Just play like you do when you think no one is listening. The community center parking lot was half full when they arrived. Margaret saw several young people carrying instrument cases heading toward the entrance. A tall young man with a violin case held the door open for Margaret and Sam. Are you here for the auditions? He asked politely. She is, Sam answered, nodding toward Margaret. The young man looked surprised, but quickly covered it with a smile. Good luck, he said, but Margaret could hear the doubt in his voice. Inside, the lobby was bustling with activity. Musicians of all kinds were warming up in corners or chatting in small groups. Most were in their 20s or 30s, dressed in stylish clothes and radiating confidence. Margaret suddenly felt very out of place. Sam led her to the registration table where a woman with short red hair sat checking people in. Her name tag read Linda Garner, Selection Committee Chair. Hello, Sam said. Margaret Collins is here to audition. Linda looked up, her eyes moving between Sam and Margaret with confusion. Are you Mr. Collins? She asked Sam. No, I'm Sam Peterson, just the driver. Margaret is the one auditioning. Linda's expression shifted to surprise as she looked at Margaret. Oh, Mrs. Collins. I spoke with you on the phone last week. She glanced down at her list. For the piano performance, correct? Yes, Margaret replied firmly, trying to keep her voice steady. Well, that's wonderful, Linda said, though her tone suggested otherwise. She turned to a man sitting next to her. Paul, this is Margaret Collins. She's auditioning for the piano spot. Paul Martinez, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper. Hare looked up from his notes. His eyebrows rose slightly. Mrs. Collins, welcome. He cleared his throat. You should know that the summer concert series is quite demanding. Our performers usually play for an hour, sometimes longer. I'm aware of the requirements, Margaret said. I've attended the concerts for many years. Of course, Paul nodded. It's just that the physical stamina required. I've prepared Chopin's Ballade No. 1, Margaret interrupted, tired of their assumptions. I believe it demonstrates both technical skill and emotional interpretation. Paul and Linda exchanged glances. Very well, Linda said, handing Margaret a number. You'll be performer number 14. Please take a seat in the waiting area. We'll call you when it's your turn. Sam squeezed Margaret's arm. I'll be right here when you're done, he promised. Knocked their socks off. Margaret made her way to the waiting area, a section of chairs set up near the auditorium doors. She sat down carefully, placing her handbag in her lap. Around her, the young musicians continued their conversations, occasionally glancing at her with curiosity. Excuse me, a voice said. Margaret looked up to see a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes. Are you Margaret Collins, the piano teacher? Margaret nodded, surprised to be recognized. I'm Olivia Baker, the young woman said, sitting down. Next to her, you taught my mother, Karen Baker, years ago? She always spoke so highly of you, Karen Margaret repeated, memories flooding back. Hey, she had such a lovely touch with Debussy. How is she? She's well. She still plays, actually. She has a piano in her home and plays for her grandchildren. Olivia smiled. I play flute. I'm auditioning today, too. That's wonderful, Margaret said, feeling a warm glow at this connection. To her past, what made you decide to audition? Olivia asked. I mean, after teaching for so long? Margaret paused, considering the question. I'm not entirely sure, she admitted. Perhaps I needed to remind myself that I'm still here, still, capable of creating something beautiful. Their conversation was interrupted by a man calling out, Number 14, Margaret Collins. That's me, Margaret said, standing up slowly. Good luck, Olivia whispered. Margaret walked toward the auditorium doors, her heart pounding. It's the man, who introduced himself as the stage manager, led her into the large room. 3 tables had been set up at the center, where Linda, Paul, and 3 others sat with notepads. A grand piano stood on the stage, its lid fully open. Mrs. Collins will be performing Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, the stage manager announced. Before gesturing for Margaret to take the stage, Margaret climbed the few steps carefully, aware of every eye on her. She heard whispers from the committee table. One woman leaned over to Paul, said something that made him frown and shake his head. The walk to the piano felt longer than it was. Margaret finally reached the bench and sat down, adjusting its height slightly. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment, feeling their stiffness. Had this all been a terrible mistake? She looked out at the committee members. Their faces showed polite interest, mixed with skepticism. Behind them, several other performers had slipped into the auditorium to watch. Margaret spotted Olivia standing by the door, giving her a small thumbs up. Margaret turned back to the piano. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling their cool smoothness beneath her fingers. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting the noise and doubts fade away. Then she began to play. The opening notes of the ballade floated through the air, gentle and questioning. Margaret felt the familiar connection with the music, a conversation between herself and Chopin across the centuries. As the piece developed, growing more complex, she surrendered to its demands. Her fingers, which had been stiff and painful that morning, seemed to remember their old flexibility. They moved across the keys with purpose, finding the notes even when her eyes couldn't follow fast enough. She knew this piece not just in her mind but in her body, in the very bones of her hands. When she reached the more technically challenging sections, Margaret didn't hold back. She played with all the passion and skill she possessed, letting the music surge and recede like waves. There were a few missed notes, places where her fingers couldn't quite keep up with her intentions. But she didn't let these small failures interrupt the story she was telling. And it was a story of youth and age, of loss and discovery, of the beauty that remains even when everything else is stripped away. Margaret put her whole life into those notes, the joy of her marriage to Joe, the satisfaction of guiding young musicians, the loneliness of recent years, and this new, unexpected chance to be heard. As she approached the final dramatic section of the piece, Margaret felt tears forming behind her closed eyes. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of connection, of feeling fully alive and present in this moment. The final notes rang out, powerful and resolute. Then silence. Margaret opened her eyes, suddenly aware again of where she was and what she had done. The committee members sat frozen, their pens still in their hands. Linda Garner's mouth was slightly open in surprise. Behind them, the audience of fellow performers stood completely still. Then Olivia began to clap. The sound broke the spell, and suddenly, everyone was applauding. Paul Martinez stood up, joined quickly by the others. Margaret saw tears on Linda's cheeks. "Thank you, Mrs. Collins," Paul said, when the applause finally died down. His voice sounded different now, with a new respect. "That was ... extraordinary." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She rose from the bench, her legs a bit unsteady, and made her way back down the steps. As she walked past the committee table, Linda reached out and touched her arm. "We'll be in touch very soon," she said softly. Outside in the lobby, Sam jumped up when he saw her. "How did it go?" Margaret tried to find the words to describe what had just happened. How for a few minutes she had transcended her age and her limitations. How she had remembered what it felt like to truly play. "I think," she said slowly, "that they might have heard me." Margaret sat by her phone for 2 days after the audition. She jumped each time it rang, but it was never the call she was waiting for. Sam stopped by on Wednesday afternoon with a pot of soup and fresh bread from the bakery down the street. "Anything?" he asked, setting the food on her kitchen counter. Margaret shook her head. "Not yet, but Linda said they would be in touch soon." "Soon could mean anything," Sam said, waving his hand. "These committee types move at their own pace." Margaret nodded, trying not to show her disappointment. Perhaps she had imagined the impact of her performance. Maybe the tears she thought she saw in Linda's eyes were just a trick of the light. Maybe the standing applause had been mere politeness for an old woman who had tried her best. Being silly, she said, more to herself than to Sam. There were so many talented young people there. Of course they would choose one of them. Sam frowned. "Don't sell yourself short, Margaret. I've known you for years, and I've never seen you as alive as when you talk about music. Whatever happens with this concert, you've already won by getting back to the piano." Margaret smiled at her friend. "When did you get so wise, Sam Peterson?" "Around the same time my hair turned gray," he replied with a laugh. After Sam left, sat at her piano, but didn't play. Instead, she traced the familiar pattern of scratches on the wood. The small chip on the B-flat key, the slight discoloration of the ivory from years of use. This piano had been with her through so much of her life. It had seen her through her marriage, her teaching career, Joe's death, and now her latent life returned to performing. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Margaret hurried to answer it, her heart pounding. "Hello, Margaret Collins speaking." "Mrs. Collins, this is Linda Garner from the Oak Ridge Summer Concert Series Committee." Margaret gripped the phone tighter. "Yes, hello, Linda." "I'm calling about your audition," Linda said, her voice formal. "The committee has made its decisions." There was a pause that felt to Margaret like an eternity. "We would like to offer you the opening night performance slot," Linda continued. "Your interpretation of Chopin was exactly the kind of emotional depth we're looking for to start our series." Margaret sank into her chair, speechless for a moment. "Are you sure?" she finally managed to ask. Linda's voice softened. "It's very sure. You moved every person in that room, Mrs. Collins. Paul hasn't stopped talking about your performance. Said it was like hearing Chopin for the first time." "I don't know what to say," Margaret admitted. "Say yes," Linda urged. "The opening concert is in 3 weeks. You'll need to prepare a 1-hour program. Can you do that?" Margaret thought about her arthritic hands, about the pain and stiffness that worsened when she played too long. But she also thought about how it felt to make music again, to communicate through the piano in a way words never could. "Yes," she said firmly, "I can do that." After hanging up, Margaret sat in stunned silence. She had been chosen. It's not out of pity, but because her playing had touched something in the committee members. Joy bubbled up inside her, and she laughed out loud, something she rarely did these days. She had to tell someone. She picked up the phone again and dialed Sam's number. "I got it," she exclaimed when he answered. "The opening night performance? I knew it," Sam shouted back, his voice full of pride. "Didn't I tell you? Didn't I say they'd be crazy not to choose you?" "You did," Margaret agreed, smiling so widely her cheeks hurt. "But now I have 3 weeks to prepare a full hour of music. I haven't played that long in years." "You'll be wonderful," Sam assured her. "This calls for a celebration. I'm taking you to dinner at Carlo's tonight." News of Margaret's selection spread quickly through the small town of Oak Ridge. By the next day, several local people had stopped her on her way to the grocery store to congratulate her. Mrs. Green, from the apartment below. Her said she would invite friends over to listen from her apartment on the nights Margaret practiced. The clerk at the pharmacy, whose daughter had taken lessons from Margaret years ago, offered her a special hand cream that might help with her arthritis. Margaret was touched by the community's response, but also felt a growing pressure. People were excited to hear her play. What if she disappointed them? What if her hands couldn't handle a full hour of performance? What if she forgot the music or made too many mistakes? These worries kept her up at night, but during the day, she channeled her anxiety into preparation. She carefully selected pieces that showcased different moods and styles, but wouldn't strain her hands too much. Debussy's Clair de Lune for its dreamy quality, Bach's Prelude in C major for its elegant simplicity, a few of Chopin's shorter works, and of course, the ballade that had won her the spot. Margaret established a practice routine. She would warm up with gentle scales and exercises, then work on one piece at a time, taking breaks when the pain in her hands became too much. She soaked her hands in warm water before playing and applied ice afterward. She took the anti-inflammatory medication her doctor had prescribed more regularly now, a week before the performance. Linda called to check on her progress. "How are the preparations coming along, Mrs. Collins?" she asked. "Please call me Margaret," she replied, "and they're coming along well. I've selected the pieces and have been practicing daily." "Excellent. We've had a lot of interest in your performance. The local newspaper wants to do a feature on you. Would that be all right?" Margaret hesitated. She had never sought attention or publicity. "I suppose so, if you think it would help." The concert series, it would, Linda assured her. And people are curious about you. It's not every day that someone rediscovers their passion at 78. The reporter from the Oak Ridge Gazette came the next day. Her name was Diane Foster, a friendly woman in her 40s who seemed genuinely interested in Margaret's story. Made you decide to audition after so many years away from performing? Diane asked, her pen poised over her notebook. Margaret considered the question carefully. I wasn't planning to, she admitted. My neighbor Sam brought me the flyer. I think he knew I missed music even before I did. And how does it feel to be preparing for a public performance at this stage of your life? Terrifying, Margaret said with a small laugh, but also wonderful. Like finding a part of myself I thought was gone forever. Diane smiled. Would you play something for me, just so I can describe your playing in the article? Margaret nodded and moved to the piano. She chose Debussy's Clair de Lune, letting the gentle notes fill her small apartment. When she finished, she turned to find Diane wiping tears from her eyes. That was beautiful, the reporter said softly. Now I understand why the committee chose you. The article appeared in the paper 3 days later. Local piano teacher returns to the stage at 78. Read the headline. The story painted a touching picture of Margaret's journey from teacher to performer, emphasizing her passion for music and her courage in facing a new challenge. The final paragraph quoted Paul Martinez. Mrs. Collins doesn't just play the notes. She tells a story with them, a story that comes from a lifetime of experiences. That's something you can't teach and you can't fake. The article generated even more interest in the upcoming performance. Margaret received calls from former students who planned to attend. The retirement home where she occasionally volunteered arranged for a van to bring residents to the concert. Sam reported that nearly all the tickets for opening night had been sold. As the day of the performance drew closer, Margaret's anxiety grew alongside her excitement. She practiced diligently, but worried that her aging body might betray her. Her hands ached more than usual, and sometimes she woke in the night with painful cramps in her fingers. 2 days before the concert, during a particularly difficult practice session, Margaret hit a wrong note in the ballade and slammed her hands down on the keys in frustration. I can't do this, she said aloud to her empty apartment. I was foolish to think I could. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew. She would not give up. She had worked too hard, come too far. She would play, even if her performance wasn't perfect. She would share her love of music with her community one more time. That night, Margaret dreamed of Joe. He was sitting beside her on the piano bench, as he often had during their marriage, turning pages for her and listening with his eyes closed. In the dream, he smiled at her and said, "Play from your heart, Maggie. That's all anyone can ask." Margaret woke with tears on her cheeks but a sense of peace in her heart. She would play from her heart, and that would be enough. The day of the concert arrived with perfect summer weather. Sunshine bathed the town of Oak Ridge, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of nearby gardens. Margaret woke early, her sleep having been restless and filled with dreams of playing too. Empty halls, or forgetting her music entirely, she went through her morning routine slowly, taking extra care with each task. She did the gentle hand exercises her doctor had recommended, soaked her fingers in warm water, and massaged her joints with the special cream from the pharmacy. Every small movement was focused on preparing her hands for tonight's performance. At 10 o'clock the phone rang. It was Sam. "Big day," he said cheerfully. "How are you feeling?" "Like a bundle of nerves," Margaret admitted. "I barely slept." "That's normal," Sam assured her. "Even the professionals get nervous. Remember what Olivia Baker told you?" Margaret smiled at the memory. Olivia, the young flutist whose mother had been Margaret's student, had visited 3 days ago with flowers and encouragement. "My flute teacher says nerves are just excitement in disguise," Olivia had told her. "It means you care about what you're doing." "Picking you up at 5, Sam continued. "Linda wants you at the park by 5:30 to check the piano and get comfortable with the space." The summer concerts were held in Oak Ridge Park, where a permanent band shell provided excellent acoustics for outdoor performances. On concert nights, rows of chairs were set up on the lawn, though many people preferred to bring blankets and picnic on the grass further back. "Thank you, Sam," Margaret said. I don't know what I would do without you. You'd manage just fine, he replied. But I'm glad to help. After hanging up, Margaret moved to her piano. She had decided not to practice her full program today, too. Save her hands for tonight. Instead, she played just a few passages from each piece, reminding her fingers of the movements they would need to make later as she played the opening notes of Clair de Lune. Margaret was transported back to the first time she had heard the piece. She had been a young girl, maybe 12 years old, when her piano teacher, Mrs. Wilson, had played it. The beauty of the music had brought tears to young Margaret's eyes, and from that moment, she had been determined to learn it. Now, all these decades later, she was preparing to perform it for her community. Life had a way of coming full circle, she thought. The hours passed both too quickly and too slowly. Margaret ate a light lunch, then rested for a while, knowing she would need her energy for the evening. She selected her outfit carefully, a navy blue dress with a subtle pattern of silver threads that caught the light when she moved. Joe had always liked her in blue. She added her pearl necklace and earrings, applied a touch of makeup, and styled her silver hair neatly. Looking in the mirror, Margaret saw a dignified elderly woman. There were deep lines around her eyes and mouth, evidence of both laughter and sorrow over the years. Her hands, visible in the mirror as she adjusted her necklace, showed blue veins and swollen knuckles. But her eyes were bright with anticipation. Sam arrived precisely at 5 o'clock, dressed in a suit and tie. "You look beautiful," he said when Margaret opened the door. "And you look very handsome," she replied, touched by his formal attire. "You didn't need to dress up so much just to drive me." "It's not every day my friend is the star of the show," Sam said with a wink. "Besides, I want everyone to know I'm with the pianist." They drove to the park in comfortable silence. Margaret watched the familiar streets of Oakridge pass by, the town where she had spent nearly her entire adult life. She had walked these sidewalks as a young bride, as a dedicated teacher, as a grieving widow, and now as a performer rediscovering her passion. The park was already bustling with activity. When they arrived, crew members were setting up the sound system and arranging chairs. A large piano had been placed at the center of the bandshell stage. Margaret's heart beat faster at the sight of it. Linda Garner hurried over when she spotted them. "Margaret, I'm so glad you're here. Come, let me show you to the green room where you can wait until the performance. We've set up a small practice keyboard there if you want to warm up." The green room was actually a small building near the bandshell that usually served as a storage space for park equipment. Today it had been transformed with a comfortable chair, a small table with water and snacks, and an electric keyboard. "Piano tuner just finished with the grand piano," Linda explained. "It sounds wonderful. Would you like to try it now before people start arriving?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, I'd like that very much." They walked to the bandshell where Margaret climbed a few steps to the stage. The grand piano was much larger than her upright at home, its polished black surface gleaming in the early evening light. She sat on the bench and positioned her hands over the keys, feeling their cool smoothness beneath her fingertips. She played a few notes, then a scale, testing the action and sound of the instrument. It responded beautifully, with a rich, resonant tone that carried well in the open space of the bandshell. "It's lovely," Margaret said, looking up at Linda and Sam, who stood watching her. "I'm so glad you like it," Linda replied. "Take all the time you need to get comfortable with it. People will start arriving in about 30 minutes. Linda went off to handle other preparations, leaving Margaret alone with Sam. She continued to play short passages, familiarizing herself with the piano's touch. "I'll be right in the front row," Sam promised. "If you get nervous, just look for me." Margaret smiled gratefully at her friend. "Thank you for pushing me to do this, Sam. Whatever happens tonight, I'm glad I tried." "Nothing bad is going to happen," Sam assured her. "You're going to be wonderful." As the time for the performance drew closer, Margaret returned to the green room to rest and collect her thoughts. She could hear the growing murmur of voices as the audience arrived. Occasionally, someone would pass by the small window, giving her glimpses of people in summer clothes carrying chairs and blankets. At exactly 7 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. It was Paul Martinez. "It's time, Mrs. Collins," he said, with a warm smile. "Are you ready?" Margaret took a deep breath and stood up. "As ready as I'll ever be." Paul offered his arm and she took it gratefully. They walked together toward the band shell, the noise of the crowd growing louder with each step. When they reached the side of the stage, Paul paused. "I want to thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" Margaret asked, surprised. "For reminding me why we do this," Paul replied. "It's not about technical perfection. It's about moving people. With music, your audition changed how I listen." Before Margaret could respond, Linda stepped onto the stage with a microphone. The crowd quieted as she began to speak. "Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the opening night of the Oak Ridge Summer Concert Series," Linda said, her voice carrying across the park. "We have a very special performance for you tonight." Many of you know Margaret Collins as the piano teacher who has shaped the musical education of Oak Ridge for decades. Tonight, she steps onto our stage not as a teacher, but as an artist in her own right. A wave of applause swept through the audience. From where she stood, Margaret could see that every chair was filled, and many more people sat on blankets spread across the lawn. She spotted former students, neighbors, faces she recognized from around town, all there to hear her play. "Please join me in welcoming to the stage Margaret Collins," Linda concluded. The applause grew louder as Paul led Margaret onto the stage. She walked carefully to the piano, aware of every eye upon her. She took her seat and adjusted the bench. She searched the front row and found Sam smiling encouragingly. Next to him sat Olivia Baker and an older woman who must be her mother, Karen. Margaret placed her hands in her lap for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The crowd grew quiet. Waiting, she looked out at the sea of faces, many of them people whose lives had intersected with hers over the years. She felt a sudden wave of gratitude for this community, for this moment. Then, with a small nod to herself, Margaret placed her hands on the keys and began to play Bach's Prelude in C major. The clear, precise notes floated out over the park. As the evening light began to soften into dusk, as she played, Margaret felt her nervousness melt away, replaced by the pure joy of making music for others to hear. Tonight she would tell her story through her fingers, and the people of Oak Ridge would listen. The first notes of Bach's Prelude in C major floated across Oak Ridge Park, clear and precise in the summer evening air. Margaret's fingers moved with practiced ease over the keys, finding each note with confidence. As she played, she kept her eyes on the music, aware of the hundreds of people watching, but focused entirely on the piece. The Bach was a good choice to begin with. Its familiar pattern of arpeggios helped settle her nerves, allowing her hands to find their rhythm as the final notes of the prelude faded away. There was a moment of silence before the audience burst into applause. Margaret looked up, surprised by the enthusiastic response to what had simply been her opening piece. She smiled slightly and nodded in acknowledgement before turning to her next selection. She had arranged her program to alternate between more technically challenging pieces and gentler, more emotional ones to give her hands periods of rest. Her second piece, she moved into Debussy's Clair de Lune. As she began the dreamy opening notes, the park grew even quieter. The evening light was fading now, and small lanterns along the pathways had been lit, creating a magical atmosphere that perfectly matched the music's mood. Margaret allowed herself to be carried away by the piece, the one that had first made her fall in love with piano as a young girl. Her interpretation was not the same as when she was younger. It was richer now, informed by decades of living, of loving, of loss. Where once she had played it with youthful wonder, now she played it with the wisdom of experience. In the front row, Sam watched his friend with pride. He noticed how the audience seemed to lean forward collectively, drawn in by the beauty Margaret was creating. Even those who had come with picnics and chattering children had fallen silent, captivated by the elderly woman whose fingers were painting pictures with sound as Margaret moved through her program, playing selections from Mozart, Schumann, and Schubert. She grew more confident. Her body remembered what it felt like to perform, to communicate through music. The pain in her hands was still there, but it seemed less important now, overshadowed by the joy of connecting with the audience between pieces. She would take a moment to flex her fingers discreetly, or to take a small sip of water from the app glass Linda had placed on the piano. But these brief pauses only added to the rhythm of the performance. giving the audience time to absorb what they had just heard before moving on to the next musical journey. When Margaret reached the midpoint of her program, she paused a bit longer and turned to address the audience for the first time. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she said, her voice clear but gentle. "The next piece I'll play is Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. I've loved this piece since I was a young woman. To me, it speaks of quiet evenings and peaceful reflection." Personal connections seemed to bring the audience even closer. As Margaret played the Nocturne, she noticed an elderly couple near the front holding hands, their eyes closed as they swayed slightly to the music. Further back, a mother was cradling a sleeping baby, rocking gently with the rhythm of the piece. Music had always had this power, Margaret reflected as she played. It could bring strangers together, could bridge gaps between generations, could express feelings that words could not reach. This was why she had taught for so many years, hoping to pass on not just technique, but this deeper understanding of music's importance. After the Nocturne came to shorter Chopin preludes, then a lively Mozart sonata movement that showcased Margaret's still nimble fingerwork. The audience responded with increasingly enthusiastic applause after each piece. Margaret could see Linda and Paul at the side of the stage, both smiling broadly. Finally, it was time for her closing piece. The one that had won her this opportunity, Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. Margaret took a slightly longer pause before beginning, gathering her energy for this most demanding piece in her program. "For my final selection tonight," she said to the audience, "I'll play the piece I performed at my audition." Chopin's Ballade tells a story without words, a story of questioning, of struggle, and ultimately of triumph. In many ways, it has become my own story too. With those words, she turned back to the piano and began to play. The opening notes posed their gentle question, hanging in the air like a thought not yet completed. Then the piece began to build, growing more complex, more passionate. Margaret felt completely in the moment now, every note intentional, every phrase shaped with care. Her hands, which had been stiff with arthritis that morning, moved with surprising freedom. There was still pain, but it seemed distant, as if it belonged to someone else. What mattered was the music, the story she was telling, as the ballade progressed toward its dramatic conclusion. Margaret was aware of a special quality of attention from the audience. The park was absolutely silent except for the music. The usual evening sounds, distant traffic, children's voices, the rustle of trees in the breeze seemed to have paused to listen. Margaret poured everything into the final section, all her joy at rediscovering her gift, all her gratitude for this second chance, all her love for the community that had supported her throughout her life. Her fingers flew across the keys with a strength and certainty that belied her age. When she struck the final chords, powerful and resolute, she felt as if she had completed not just the piece, but a journey that had begun decades ago. The last notes rang out across the park. Hanging in the air for a moment before fading away, there was complete silence. Then, from somewhere in the back, a single person began to clap. Others joined immediately, the applause spreading like a wave until the entire audience was on their feet. The sound was overwhelming. Hundreds of people, clapping, cheering, some even wiping away tears. Margaret sat at the piano, momentarily stunned by the response. She had hoped the audience would enjoy her playing, but this outpouring of appreciation was beyond anything she had imagined. She rose slowly from the bench and turned to face the crowd, offering a small, dignified bow. The applause continued, showing no signs of diminishing. Margaret saw Sam in the front row, clapping harder than anyone, his face shining with pride. Next to him, Olivia and her mother were calling bravo. Linda hurried onto the stage with a bouquet of flowers, her eyes glistening with tears.
"Margaret,"
Linda said, handing her the flowers. "That was extraordinary. You've set a new standard for our concert series." The applause finally began to subside as Linda stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "Margaret Collins." Another round of applause erupted as Margaret took a second bow. When it quieted, Linda continued, "I think we all experienced something special tonight. Music has the power to touch our hearts, to wake us up to beauty, and Margaret's performance did exactly that. Thank you, Margaret, for sharing your gift with us." As Margaret left the stage, people rose from their seats to greet her. Former students rushed forward with congratulations. Strangers told her how moved they had been. An elderly man with tears in his eyes simply took her hand and said, "Thank you. I had forgotten what it feels like to be truly awakened by music." Sam stood nearby, allowing Margaret her moment but staying close in case she needed him. When she finally made her way to him, he wrapped her in a gentle hug. "You were magnificent," he said. "I always knew you had it in you. Couldn't have done it without your encouragement," Margaret replied. "You were right to push me out of my comfort zone." Later that night, after the crowds had dispersed and Sam had driven her home, Margaret sat alone in her apartment. Her hands ached now, the pain returning as the adrenaline of performance faded, but it was a good kind of ache. The satisfying tiredness that comes from using a gift fully. She thought about the faces in the audience, about the comments people had made afterward. So many had said her playing had awakened something in them memories. Emotions, a sense of possibility they had forgotten. Margaret smiled as she gently closed the lid of her piano. They had called her too old to play, but age had given her music a depth and meaning it couldn't have had in her youth. Her fingers had awakened a sleeping crowd, but the crowd had awakened something in her too. It's the knowledge that it's never too late to share your gift with the world.